number, single dad saved a disabled heiress the next morning. The entire city knew his name. That night, in the middle of a cold, cutting rain, a man no one had ever heard of quietly carried a disabled young woman away from an overturned car on the side of an empty road, and he had absolutely no idea who she was. He thought he had simply saved a life. Just one life. That was all. But when morning came and his name appeared on every large screen across the city, on glass towers and transit boards, and the front of the evening news, he finally understood that the woman he had pulled from that wreckage was no ordinary stranger. And the choice he had made in the dark, with no witness and no reward waiting for him, had accidentally reached into a secret so deep that it would shake the entire city to its foundation. Elias Carter was 38 years old, and he had long since made peace with the fact that nobody noticed him, not in the way that mattered. He drove freight routes at night through the outer districts of the city, worked occasional day labor when the routes dried up, and came home before dawn to whatever hours of sleep he could steal before his daughter woke up and needed breakfast. His apartment sat on the 4th floor of a narrow building on Caldwell Street, the kind of building where the elevator broke twice a year, and the landlord responded to maintenance requests with a silence so practiced it felt almost artistic. 2 small bedrooms, a window that rattled every time a truck passed below, a kitchen where the light above the stove had been burned out for 6 months because Elias kept forgetting to buy a replacement bulb. Not because he was careless, because he was tired. His daughter's name was Lily, and she was 8 years old. She had her father's dark eyes and her late mother's stubbornness, and she was, without question, the most important thing Elias Carter had ever been trusted with. She had a mild form of asthma that required a small blue inhaler kept in the front pocket of her backpack at all times, and she asked the kind of questions that made adults pause, not because they were difficult, but because they were so precisely honest that a dishonest answer felt like a genuine crime. Elias spoke quietly, moved carefully, and kept most of his thoughts to himself. He was patient in the way that people become patient when they have had no other option, not from abundance, but from necessity. He gave up his seat on the bus without thinking about it. He held doors. His co-workers at the freight depot described him as solid and reliable. What they could not articulate was that Elias Carter quietly believed he was not quite enough. Not enough money to give Lily the childhood she deserved. Not enough education to push himself into better work. He loved his daughter fiercely, and that love was the thing he built his days around. But beneath it, running like a cold current under everything he did, was the persistent conviction that the world had been built for other people, and that he and Lily were simply passing through it. On the night everything changed, Elias had just finished a late-night run along the outer highway loop and was taking the long way home through the eastern suburbs because there was construction on his usual route. The rain had started an hour earlier as a light drizzle and had deepened into something heavier, the kind that turns windshields into abstract paintings and makes every distant light bleed into every other. The road through that part of the city was poorly lit, flanked by low shrubs and the occasional industrial fence, and at that hour it was almost entirely empty. He saw the car before he fully processed what he was seeing. A silver luxury sedan, the kind that cost more than he would earn in 5 years, had gone off the road and rolled onto its side in a shallow ditch along the shoulder. One wheel was still spinning slowly. The hazard lights were on, blinking weakly through the rain. Elias slowed without making a conscious decision to slow, his foot finding the brake the way it found the brake for every obstacle in the road. He pulled over 10 yards past the wreck and sat there for a moment with the wipers going and the engine running. He thought about how these situations could go wrong. He thought about how a man in his position, no connections, no safety net, could stop to help and walk away with a lawsuit or a suspicion that never quite went away. He thought about Lily asleep at home. He considered all of this in about 20 seconds. And then he got out of the truck. The rain hit him immediately, soaking through his jacket before he had taken 3 steps. He moved along the shoulder to the overturned car and crouched beside it, pressing his face close to the shattered side window. Inside, half suspended by her seatbelt, was a young woman. She was unconscious, her head resting against the crumpled interior of the door. Her legs were positioned at an angle that told him, even before he noticed the cane that had slid into the far corner of the cabin, that she had some limitation in her mobility. Her forehead had a long cut that was bleeding steadily, and her breathing, though present, was shallow. There were no other cars on the road. There had been no other cars for several minutes in either direction. Elias tried the door handle. It was jammed. He went back to his truck, took the short crowbar he kept beneath the passenger seat, and returned. He worked the door frame in the rain until it gave, the metal complaining loudly, and he reached inside and unclipped the seatbelt with one hand while bracing her weight with the other. Carefully, more carefully than he had been careful about anything in a long time, he lifted her free of the wreckage and carried her to his truck, settling her across the back seat with her bag placed beside her. He took off his jacket and folded it under her head. Then, he drove. The nearest hospital was 14 minutes away, and Elias drove those 14 minutes with one hand on the wheel and one eye in the rearview mirror, watching the rise and fall of her chest to make sure she was still breathing. He pulled up to the emergency entrance at a speed that made the security guard outside look up sharply, and he was through the sliding doors before the guard had finished processing what he had seen. He told the intake nurse everything he knew, which was almost nothing. A woman, early 30s, found in an overturned vehicle off the Eastern Highway Loop, head laceration, possibly limited mobility in her lower body, unconscious for approximately 15 minutes. He handed over the bag carefully, unopened. The emergency team moved quickly, and within minutes she had been wheeled away behind a set of double doors that swung shut with a sound of finality. A nurse asked Elias if he was family. He said no. She asked if he could provide insurance information or emergency contacts. He said he didn't have any. She asked if he would like to leave his contact information and come back in the morning. He said he would wait. He waited in a plastic chair in the corridor outside the emergency wing, still damp from the rain, his jacket gone, his phone at 11% battery. After 40 minutes, a billing administrator came to him with paperwork and explained that without insurance on file, the hospital would need a deposit to continue treatment. The number she named, $1,200, was almost exactly what Elias had in his savings account. Not a metaphorical almost. A literal almost. He transferred it from his phone with hands that were entirely steady, and then he sat back down in the plastic chair and waited some more. He did not know the woman's name. He did not open her bag. He did not look through the window of the treatment room. He sat with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the floor tiles, a man who had done what seemed like the obvious thing and was simply waiting to know that it had worked. At 6:47 the following morning, Elias Carter's name was on the news. He did not know this immediately because he had finally fallen asleep in the plastic chair sometime around 4 in the morning and did not wake until a hand touched his shoulder, and he looked up to find a hospital administrator standing over him with an expression that suggested something significant had shifted in the atmosphere of the building. Before the administrator could speak, Elias noticed that two of the nurses at the station down the hall were looking at a phone screen together and then looking at him. A security guard near the entrance had done the same. He did not understand what was happening until he turned on his own phone, now down to 3%, and found 17 missed calls from a number he did not recognize. The woman in the treatment room was Charlotte Hayes. She was 32 years old. She was the only daughter and primary heir of Richard Hayes, founder of Hayes Group, a corporation with holdings in real estate, logistics, and biomedical development operating across 11 states and employing over 40,000 people. Charlotte had been partially paralyzed since childhood following a spinal condition, and she had spent the last decade as her father's closest advisor and the quiet intelligence behind the company's most significant decisions. She was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most consequential figures in the city's economic landscape, and she had been found unconscious in a ditch in the rain by a freight driver who earned $14 an hour. The hospital's external security camera had captured Elias carrying her through the emergency entrance. The footage had somehow made its way out of the building before dawn. No one could later explain exactly how. By 6 in the morning, it had been picked up by 2 local news stations. By 6:47, it was everywhere. The image was unmistakable even in poor resolution. A large man moving through the rain with a woman in his arms, deliberate and unhurried, her head against his shoulder, his expression unreadable. Within the hour, the Hayes Group Communications Office had confirmed that Charlotte Hayes had been in a vehicular accident and was receiving medical care, and that the company was seeking information about the individual who had brought her in. Elias was still sitting in the plastic chair when the first news van appeared in the hospital parking lot. By 9 in the morning, his face had been identified from the hospital security footage and cross-referenced against his truck's registration, which had been captured in a second camera angle. Someone had found the registration. Someone had found his name. And then, with the particular momentum these things develop once they begin, his name and face were everywhere on television screens, in restaurant windows, on digital displays above the highway, on the front pages of news sites in a city that had never once found reason to print his name before. He was being called the Rain Hero in the initial coverage, a label applied quickly by a morning anchor who needed something to call him. It stuck immediately, the way imprecise things sometimes do when they capture the shape of something true, even if they miss the details. His neighbor on the third floor, a woman named Deborah who had lived in the building for 11 years and had exchanged perhaps 40 words with Elias in all that time, knocked on his door at 10 in the morning to tell him that he was on television. 3 of his former co-workers from a construction job 2 years prior sent him messages within the same hour. His daughter's school called to ask if he would be available to speak with the principal. He did not call back. The Hayes Group had posted a formal notice offering a significant reward to any individual who could provide confirmed information leading to the identification of the person who had assisted Charlotte Hayes. That notice was quietly withdrawn before noon, when it became clear that the identification had already been made by approximately everyone. Elias did not step outside his apartment that day. He sat on the couch with Lily beside him and watched a portion of the coverage through the small television in the living room before he turned it off. He was aware, in a precise and uncomfortable way, of the gap between what was being said about him and what had actually happened. He had not run toward a burning building. He had not made a heroic calculation. He had pulled over on a road in the rain and done the thing that seemed necessary and then sat in a plastic chair for 6 hours because he didn't feel right about leaving. That was all. The version being described on television involved a man of exceptional courage and moral clarity, and while Elias was not willing to say that version was wrong, exactly, he found something about it deeply unsettling. Lily had noticed the coverage before he turned off the television. She was 8, and she was observant, and she had seen a face she recognized on the screen in a context that her father had not adequately prepared her for. She sat beside him on the couch and was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was organizing her thoughts. "Is that you on the TV?" she asked. Elias looked at the blank screen where the image had been. He considered his options. "It looks like me," he said carefully. Lily considered this answer with the seriousness it deserved. She did not push further right away, but she watched her father's face with the attention she brought to all things she had not yet fully understood. And she filed the question somewhere she would return to later. Charlotte Hayes opened her eyes on the afternoon of the second day. The first thing she asked for was water. The second thing she asked for was information about the man who had brought her in. The nurse on duty that afternoon was careful with her answer, explaining only that the individual was known to the hospital and had been identified publicly. Charlotte, who had been briefed during her first conscious hour by her personal assistant and by the head of Hayes Group's security team, already knew more than the nurse was prepared to tell her. She knew his name. She knew what he did for work. She knew about the savings account deposit. That last detail delivered to her in a brief and efficient summary of events by her assistant. Marcus had caused her to stop speaking for a moment in a way that those around her were not accustomed to. $1,200. The last of what he had. When Elias finally came to the hospital on the third day, it was not because he wanted to. It was because Charlotte's security team had reached him through a formal letter delivered to his apartment door by a courier at 8 in the morning, and because something in the carefully measured language of the letter, its evident effort to sound undemanding, its explicit statement that his presence was entirely optional, made him understand that declining would itself be a kind of decision he was not prepared to make. He found her sitting up in the hospital bed, her cane resting against the nightstand. She was smaller than he had expected, contained within herself in a way that made the room feel calmer. She had dark hair, and the kind of eyes that suggested she spent most of her time thinking about things she wasn't saying. She looked at him for a moment in silence, and he had the distinct sensation of being assessed not unkindly, but honestly, the way a person assesses something they intend to form a genuine opinion about. "You didn't open the bag," she said. It was not a question. "No," Elias said. She nodded once, as if this confirmed something. "The deposit," she said. "I want to return it to you." "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to." There was a pause that was not awkward in the way that pauses between strangers usually are. Elias looked briefly around the room at the flowers on the windowsill, the security detail visible through the glass of the door, the city visible in the distance through the window, and then back at her. "I just did what seemed right," he said. That's all it was. Charlotte Hayes looked at him for another moment. She had met many people who said that, and meant something else who said it as a way of performing modesty. Elias Carter said it the way a person states a fact about the weather. She recognized the absence of performance immediately, because she had spent years becoming very good at reading the difference. "I believe you," she said quietly. It was Marcus, Charlotte's assistant, who brought the first piece of information to her attention 2 days after she woke. He placed a folder on the tray beside her bed without comment, and she opened it. The report inside was from the independent mechanical inspection that the Hayes Group's security team had requested on the wrecked vehicle. The brake system had been interfered with, not failed, interfered with. There was a difference, and the difference was significant. The failure had been engineered to occur under highway speed conditions, specifically on a route that Charlotte took regularly. This was not a car accident. Charlotte read the report once and then set it down on the tray and was quiet for a long time. She had known for over a year that there were people within her father's organization who were opposed to her eventual assumption of full leadership. She had suspected for several months that the opposition was not limited to internal politics. She had not allowed herself to complete the thought further than that. The folder on the tray forced her to complete it. There was a second piece of information in the folder, added by Marcus with what she recognized as his particular brand of cautious thoroughness. In his initial account to the police on the night of the accident, Elias had mentioned seeing another vehicle pulled off the road approximately 300 yards ahead of the crash site, a dark-colored car that had been there when he arrived and was gone within a few minutes of his stopping. He had not thought much of it at the time. The police report had noted it as a passing observation, but the location matched the sight lines from which the brake interference would most logically have been confirmed, and the timing matched the window in which confirmation of the outcome would have been needed. Elias Carter had been present at a crime scene, and whoever was responsible was now aware of that. The threat came on a Tuesday, 6 days after the accident. It was indirect, designed to be indirect, delivered through a series of arrangements that could never be conclusively traced to any one person. Elias received it in the form of a visit from 2 men he had never seen before, who appeared at the freight depot where he was picking up a dispatch sheet and stood close to him in a way that was not accidental. They said nothing directly threatening. They spoke about the weather and about how unfortunate it was when private matters became public matters, and about how a man in Elias's position had a great deal to protect. They mentioned Lily by name. They did not threaten her. They simply mentioned her, the way a person might mention a fragile object on a high shelf without touching it, wanting only to ensure that you were aware of its presence. Elias drove home that evening in a state of controlled calm that Lily, watching him from the couch where she was doing her homework, recognized as different from his usual calm. She asked him if he was okay. He said he was fine and made dinner and sat across from her at the small kitchen table and ate without tasting anything, the names of those men running through his mind like a loop he couldn't find the end of. He called Marcus that night from the parking lot behind his building, standing in the cold without a jacket because he had forgotten he had left it inside, and he told Marcus what had happened in straightforward language without embellishment. Marcus was quiet on the other end of the line for a moment, and then he said that Charlotte would like to speak with Elias directly, and that this would be arranged for the following morning. Charlotte moved quickly once she understood the scope of what was happening. By the end of that day, a security detail had been placed outside Elias's building. A subtle detail. Not obvious, but there. A legal team had been put on standby. Marcus had arranged for Lily's school pickups to be covered by a trusted member of Charlotte's personal staff. Introduced to Lily simply as a friend of her father's, which was close enough to the truth that Elias allowed it. The machinery of the Hayes Group, which had spent years moving resources in the direction of commercial outcomes, had been quietly turned in the direction of protecting a freight driver and his 8-year-old daughter. Elias was uncomfortable with this. He said so to Charlotte directly, in her office at the hospital, 3 days after she had been moved out of emergency care. She was seated at a table by the window with papers arranged in front of her and the city spread out below, and she looked up at him with the direct expression he was beginning to recognize as simply how she looked. "I know you're uncomfortable," she said. "I'm asking you to let me do this anyway. I don't want to owe anyone," he said. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "You saved my life with your own savings, and you waited 6 hours and you didn't even ask my name. What I'm doing now is not a transaction. It's just the thing that needs to be done." He stood there for a moment with his hands in his pockets. It was the same reasoning he had applied to pulling over in the rain, offered back to him by the person who had been on the receiving end of it. He recognized it. He didn't have a good argument against it. "Okay," he said. The investigation moved faster than Elias had expected investigations to move. This was partly because the Hayes Group's legal team was operating with exceptional urgency, and partly because the security footage from the road where Charlotte's car had been tampered with had captured, in the upper right corner of a single frame, the partial rear plate of the dark car that Elias had mentioned. It was not enough on its own, but it was enough combined with what Elias remembered from the depot visit the men. Their manner, a particular way one of them had held his hands to build a picture. The man at the center of it was named Douglas Whitfield. He was 54 years old and had served as the Hayes Group's chief financial officer for 11 years. He was also, as the investigation revealed over the following weeks, the primary architect of a long-running financial arrangement that would have transferred a significant portion of the company's most valuable holdings to a subsidiary controlled by a small group of executives, an arrangement that Charlotte's imminent full leadership would have, immediately and irreversibly ended. He had been patient in his opposition, and then patience had run out, and he had made a decision witnessed by a man who had no reason to be on that road except that there was construction on his usual route. The public hearing was scheduled for a Thursday. Elias did not want to testify. He had never spoken in any formal public capacity in his adult life, and the thought of sitting in a room with cameras and attorneys and a crowd of people who all knew how these rooms worked produced a thorough anxiety that kept him awake the night before. He told none of this to Lily, who listened to her father's careful briefing and then leaned her head against his arm on the couch without saying anything. He walked into the hearing room the next morning in the one good suit he owned, which he had bought for a job interview 3 years prior and which still fit, and he sat down in the witness chair and looked at the room full of faces looking back at him. He described the dark car. He described its position on the road. He described the men at the freight depot. He described the way one of them had said Lily's name. His voice was steady throughout. He did not look for sympathy, and he did not perform composure. He simply stated what he had seen, in order, without elaboration, in the same tone he might have used to give directions to someone who was lost. The effect of his testimony, its plainness, its absence of agenda, was more powerful than any prepared statement in the room that day. Douglas Whitfield's attorney attempted to challenge the credibility of a man who drove freight and worked day labor. Elias answered each question in the same steady tone. He did not rise to the bait. He did not need to. The plate fragment, the timeline, the phone records, and the mechanical report had already built the structure. Elias's words were simply the last piece that made it impossible to see the structure as anything other than what it was. The verdict came quickly. Douglas Whitfield and two co-conspirators were formally charged within 10 days of the hearing. Their arraignment drew a crowd outside the courthouse building, and several journalists who covered the story focused not on the defendants, but on the footage of Elias walking out of the building afterward, alone, his jacket collar turned up against the November air, moving through the crowd without stopping. Charlotte was formally confirmed as Chief Executive Officer of Heiress Group the following month. Her first public statement in the role was brief and carefully written, and it centered not on the company's financial performance or strategic direction, but on the responsibility of institutions toward the communities that exist around them. She announced a new internal ethics charter. She announced the establishment of a community development fund. She said, in language that the business press found puzzling and the general public found striking, that the company intended to measure its success not only by what it built, but by what it refused to destroy. Elias received 3 formal offers of employment from the Heiress Group in the 2 weeks following the hearing. They were generous offers, genuinely generous, structured with care, designed to represent a real change in his circumstances. He read each one carefully. He spoke with Charlotte once by phone about all 3, and then he declined all 3 and accepted instead a coordinator position with a small nonprofit on the south side of the city that worked with adults with physical disabilities, a position that paid less than any of the offers from Heiress Group, that came with no corporate car and no expense account, and that required him to be at work by 8:30 in the morning so that he was always home before Lily's school day ended. Charlotte, when he told her, was quiet for a moment on the phone. "That's where you want to be," she said. It was not quite a question. "That's where I can do something that makes sense to me," he said. Another pause. And then she said, simply, "Good." One evening, near the end of that year, Charlotte came to the nonprofit's office on the south side of the city unannounced, without her security detail, driving herself in a car that was notably less conspicuous than the silver sedan that had changed both of their lives. She found Elias at his desk, finishing paperwork after everyone else had gone home, the office lit by a single desk lamp, a cold cup of coffee beside the keyboard, a crayon drawing taped to the wall beside the window that Lily had made and given him to hang up. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the drawing and then at him. "The whole city knows your name," she said. "Did you know that?" He glanced up from the paperwork. "I've been told. You have a wall in the transit station downtown," she said. "Someone painted it. A mural. You and the rain." He looked briefly pained. "I know." She smiled a real smile. Not the public smile he had seen in photographs, but the smaller one she reserved for things she found genuinely funny. "Does it bother you?" "A little," he admitted. She stepped into the office and sat down in the chair across from his desk, and she looked at him in the direct way she had always looked at him, the way that he had gradually come to understand meant she was about to say something she had considered carefully. "The city knows your name," she said. "They know the story, the rain, the car, the hospital. They know the version of you that was on television." She paused. "But I know the version that sat in a plastic chair for 6 hours and didn't open the bag. I know the version that transferred his last $1,200 without telling anyone. I know the version that testified in a room full of cameras and didn't once try to be anything other than exactly what he is." She stopped. "That version is the real one." Elias was quiet for a moment. "Lily thinks I'm a hero," he said. "I keep telling her I just did what seemed right." "She's 8, Charlotte said. "She knows the difference." 1 year after the night on the Eastern Highway, the nonprofit on the south side of the city opened a new wing, a resource center with adaptive equipment, employment coaching, and legal assistance designed specifically for adults navigating life with physical disabilities. The funding for the wing had been provided by a charitable foundation that had been quietly established several months prior. Charlotte Heiress was its primary donor. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, which was attended by a modest crowd of clients, volunteers, local officials, and a few journalists who had followed the story from its beginning, Elias stood at the front of the room and said a few words that he had written himself and revised several times, and that were, by any objective measure, too short for the occasion. He thanked the staff and the clients and the city, and he said that the center existed because of a lot of people who had done a lot of work, and he sat down. In the front row, Lily Carter, now 9 years old and wearing the blue coat she had asked for specifically because it had good pockets, watched her father from her seat with the kind of pride that is too large for the face that holds it. She had stopped asking whether he was the man from the television, because she had long since understood that he was, and that the television version and the real version were the same person, which was rarer than most people realized. Charlotte sat 2 seats away from Lily, close enough that they had spoken briefly before the ceremony began. Lily asking about the foundation with the directness of a child who does not see a reason to be indirect, Charlotte answering with the honesty she reserved for people she respected, regardless of their age. The conversation had lasted 4 minutes and covered 3 topics, and ended with Lily nodding once in a way that suggested she had formed a satisfactory opinion. After the ceremony, the crowd thinned to a few small groups standing in the autumn light outside the center's new entrance, and Elias and Charlotte stood together near the corner of the building, not quite apart from the others, holding cups of coffee that had come from a table inside and were already going cold. "How does it feel?" she asked. Elias looked at the building. He looked at the people still gathered near the door, a man in a motorized chair talking with one of the staff members, 2 women going over paperwork on a bench, Lily explaining something to a younger child with the solemn authority she brought to all explanations. "Like something that should have existed sooner," he said. Charlotte nodded. She looked at the same scene he was looking at. The city rose behind them in its familiar geometry of glass and steel and ordinary stone. The same city that had put his face on transit displays and called him a hero, and then, as cities do, moved on to the next thing, leaving behind only a mural in a transit station and a non-profit wing, and the particular kind of quiet reputation that settles around a person who did a real thing and then declined to make a performance of it. The city remembered him, not because he had sought its attention, not because he had stood in front of cameras and shaped a narrative, but because on a night when the rain was cold and the road was empty and no one was watching, a man had made a choice, the small, uncomplicated, entirely ordinary choice, to do what seemed right, and that choice had turned out to matter more than any of them had known it would. That was the whole story, and it was, in the end, enough.